Thank you very much, Max. I gave this talk last December in Sarasota, and those who, and there are a few in the audience who listened to it then, they can relax because I've changed it a bit, because our project's changed a bit and it's moved on a bit. But what I hope to do today, after that mind-bending talk about DNA, is exercise instead your mind, more your imagination. Because that's what grabbed me when I suddenly discovered that you could turn trees into chairs. And I'm going to tell you about that, and I'm going to tell you about the people, the ideas, the nature, and the creativity, the pink of this project. Anyway, the title of my talk is Trees Look Again. And what I want to do is just to exercise your imagination a bit on the way we think about trees. And all my life, I've kind of got interested in, though I've been in finance for much of my life, I've got interested in how we must have more eco-friendly approaches to manipulating materials and making objects. And wood, in particular, has struck me as a sort of an organic substance that we see and use every day. But what does it mean? And finally, as you'll see in this presentation, we've tried to find a sort of an echo movement that reflects those thoughts and which also obeys certain rules of aesthetics. There's actually a rather interesting Roman engineer called Marcus Vitruvius who used to follow the legions around, and he used to build wonderful bridges and rather interesting engineering designs. And he had three canons that were very important to him: firmitas, utilitas, venustas. That's, in other words, solidity, utility, and beauty. And that was just the way that I always sort of thought about objects. Anyway, I wanted to show you a picture because this is what grabbed my imagination. How about we just grow a chair? This is a representation of what we've been doing in England, largely due to a fellow called Gavin Munro, and that's going to come back to you in a moment. We'll talk more about Gavin. And he called it the Nelson armchair. The chairs that have been produced have been exhibited in museums in Barcelona, in, I believe, Rotterdam, in Edinburgh at the National Museum of Scotland, and also in Berlin. But first of all, let's take a step back and think about what is wood. Well, of course, at its most basic, we're talking about air, water, soil, and sunshine. And of course, to state the obvious, man has always worked with trees. And often in working with trees, he's always tried to produce things that are in a modern idiom. So some of these things you'll see, you use every day. You use an iPhone, you use a coffee machine. But actually, you can do some pretty interesting things with trees once you start to do so. The problem, and it's the perennial problem, is that though you can have a modern approach to producing these beautiful objects, actually modernity has actually stopped it being fast and efficient. It's actually really, really slow and inefficient when you produce things from wood. And I'm going to show you how that happens. Because you start with a tree and you start with a chair. Then, of course, you think about the process as it occurs. And you find that there's a natural deterioration in our own natural habitat. So that the flora and fauna that we have in our forests is going to be under threat. So, first of all, you actually do something incredibly stupid, I think, which is you grow a tree for about 40 years, and then you cut it down. So you cut it down in about 40 seconds. So you've grown a tree for 40 years, 40 seconds, down comes the tree. And you go through various processes that are absolutely necessary through the sawmill, the wood kiln, and eventually the timber yard, and you finally get it to the woodworking stage where you can take that material and start to work on it. And so the process goes on. You actually then make it into smaller bits of wood. So you start with big bits of wood down to smaller bits of wood. You chop it up into smaller pieces. All the time you're using lorries and cars and cranes and all these sorts of things, big sort of pathways through forests. We've got lots of those in Scotland, and destroying the vegetation and the appearance of the landscape. And finally, when you get to the finishing stage, when you're actually making your material, you actually exhibit a tendency to have even more work and more energy. So lots of energy. And finally, of course, you've got yourself a chair. But wow, That's been quite a lot of effort to go from a tree to a chair, right? So tree, chair, and all this stuff in between, all this energy, all this needless waste of material, particularly a lot of energy. Well, how long will it last? Well, anybody who's bought a chair or a piece of furniture will know that it's, the more things are complicated, the more likely they are to break. And that was when the idea came along. If we can shape and graft the tree, and grafting means taking, for those who aren't horticulturalists in the audience, grafting means it's an old technique. I mean, this was used thousands of years ago. If we take the raw material of the tree and put it with another tree, the two will stick together. So you can actually create a strong, robust substance after you've grafted it. So after you've done that, it won't take so long, there's no waste, and it'll be stronger because the joints have grown into one. And of course, the most interesting thing about this process is because it's a natural process, actually with the right species, it doesn't happen for all the trees, but with the right species, they'll actually grow back again after they've harvested. Now, onto the P of pink, the people in this. This chap on the right, Gavin Munro, as you've read in your piece, he gave a very good talk on the BBC, and it caught my attention, fired my attention, and I went up to see him. He said that his mentor, his guru, was a fellow called Chris Cattle, who'd been working on shaping trees. Actually, we're going to come back to Gavin in a moment. But actually, if you go back about 100 years, about the turn of the 20th century, there was a chap called John Dammit Krubsack, who made the fatal error of not writing down his work on producing his beautiful chair. And we're going to come back to that in a moment, because that's very important. If we're going to create a new eco-culture, we've got to write it down. We've got to, if you were, preserve the DNA to take on the idea of Robert. We've got to have something that's an operating manual that allows people to do this in their backyard. So here we have a fellow called Axel Erlendensen, and already today, Becky North and Peter Cook. So there is significant antecedents for this, people who've worked with trees and have produced beautiful objects. Gavin was actually a furniture designer. He's not an arborist, not a dendrologist, not a horticulturalist. He was interested in making beautiful furniture. And he started with driftwood furniture in California. And he formulated the idea that if we could plant our saplings, our trees, that's stage one up here, and we would water it. Then in stage two, allow that to form a tree-type shape, and we'll come back to that, because that doesn't quite work. He learned from that experience. And then finally, in 3 and 4, the wood will strengthen, become more robust, and then form the chair shape. And he actually did this. He took a hillside outside Derby in England. He built his nice terracing. He carefully planted out in rows all his little trees and produced, as you can just see there, some nice tree shapes. You actually can produce trees from chairs. So he then discovered something that whereas a chair looks like that, actually, it was better to turn it upside down and to grow the chair upwards. And he did that using some molds which he bought from a local factory. And so you can see the tree growing up through the mold and becoming the chair. And as I say, he reversed that process by turning it upside down, and that became much more successful. So he filled an entire field, about an acre and a half, so that's approximately half a hectare, with these rather sort of creepy-looking molds. They look like something out of Alien, if you've ever seen Alien, the movie. And they started to grow very successfully. And he started to produce his first chairs. And that particular chair has been transported around Europe, has been in several museums, as I say, and it's very strong. You can sit on it and it will hold your weight very robustly, very strong. That's his first working prototype. And that was actually 4 trees grown into one chair. It took about 5 years, start to finish. The beauty of it, as I said, is that it will grow again. When you finish growing your chair from your tree, you then got the basics to actually start all over again. Willow chairs take about 4 to 5 years, poplar trees about the same, willow lamps and chandeliers and sculptures 2 to 3 years, and oak dining tables rather longer. And that's what his factory looked like. It's on a sort of hillside outside Derby in a beautiful part of England called the Peak District. He's got his lamps, he's got his tables, he's got his chairs, he's got his rather nice little hut, thanks to the European Union, and a nice little sort of rest area for reading and brewing up tea. So that was a significant first step, and that's what got me excited about doing this for myself. So what actually has gone on here? An outdoor factory has been changed into an organized ecosystem that needs no mains water or electricity. It absorbs carbon and emits little more than art and furniture. So what happens in terms of the environment? Well, obviously there's 3 effects. There's the area around which the tree and the factory is placed. There's the field needing maintenance, and actually careful maintenance. When Gavin first started, the cows came in and destroyed his crop of chairs. And then the next year, the rabbits came and ate all his sort of young saplings. So you've got to look after it day to day. So it's like being a proper gardener year round. Then finally, at the harvest stage, you've got to take it into your hut and you've got to finish it. But those who've done woodwork in their life will know the pleasure that comes from carpentry and working to make something rather beautiful. We estimate, and we'd love to know more about this if this should be measured properly, we estimate that it's about 25% of the traditional carbon footprint. So that's a big saving. And because the factory is basically an organized forest, it absorbs much more CO2 than it actually uses. Now, what do you need in terms of your operating manual to get started? Well, you just need some basic gardener's tools. So probably anyone who's done any gardening will have had these tools in the back of their shed and taken them out at times to use. So, you also need a few little sort of bits and pieces. Those little funny little clips we found were actually better than the original molds. So we used the clips rather more when we got going. We took away the molds and we started using boards and clipping the trees to the boards, and that worked pretty well. So these are the techniques that have been around, certainly in England, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The ideas of coppicing, grafting, pollarding. Those are well known to anybody who's ever worked with trees. And by working with nature, we reckon we've gone from losing 30% of our crop to pests and disease to about 5%. So this is very significant. What do they look like? Well, we're still producing them. We've sold some lampshades. We sold some lampshades in Zurich and to other people. We've got, I think, 2,023 people wanting to buy these objects. I mentioned this rather nice object before, the Nelson. There it is again. And we have various forms of lampshades that can be worked carefully. A hexagon pendant. We've also got a square pendant. These are standard products, seasoned and hand finished in spring. That's an ash chair that we produced. But where do we go from here? This is actually much bigger than just producing chairs from trees. It's really about rethinking how we use and manufacture all our objects. And by the way, maybe technology can help, because if you think about organic 3D printing, there's obviously some ways in which CAD can help us think in 4th dimension. So this actually can be used in a practical way in the future. So really, there's no limitation to what we do, except the limitation of our imagination. So there's all sorts of things, and we can probably all go away and think about things we can use this for. I just put a few down here. Willow sculptures, red oak recliners and love seats, hazel chests of drawers, even an ash coffin. You can make one for yourself for the final days. Sycamore wheels on bikes, applewood chandeliers, grown hammocks. It really has huge potential. And one of the obvious areas of development would be in the third world, where, of course, there's many children in the world don't have seats to sit on. For example, there's 1.2 million schools in India, and a lot of the children just sit on the dust. Well, what if they grow their own stools, grow their own chairs? They can either sit on them or sell them to to rich Westerners. It's quite an interesting thought, that. So what's evolving here is a kind of design language. We're talking of these basic materials, these basic tools we use, and knowledge. And knowledge is really the thing we're trying to build up, because without knowledge, being able to transmit this to everyone that wishes to use it, this thing could just become another craft that just dies, a little artisanal activity that has a little brief moment in the sunshine and then is lost. We don't want that to happen. So something that started life as an art project really can be used anywhere in the world as an eco-friendly value-added cash crop that's perhaps as beautiful as anything that's been produced before. So that brings me on to the final stage of my story, which is my plans in Scotland. I think some people in this audience may have been to Scotland. They'll know it. It's rather a beautiful place, has lots of rain, perfect for growing trees. Used to actually be one big forest. It was called the Caledonian Forest once upon a time, and man came along and cut down all the trees, made glass, did all the things that man does. Actually, that area that has been very badly treated by bad forestation and over intensive agriculture. And here's a picture of my family farm in Scotland. That's looking due west down towards Loch Lomond, the Atlantic Ocean. As you can see, we've got lots of space there. And in November this year, we're going to plant out 33 hectares. You normally get about 2,500 trees per hectare. So I reckon that's about 80,000 trees we'll be planting. We can only probably work on artisanally about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 trees, because it's just so much work to be applied, unless we can find lots of people to help us. And the nice thing about this is that you can start by planting your trees, have a lovely, lovely woodland tree forest, and you don't actually have to start working on the trees for about 2 years, because the first part of the life cycle of the tree chairs is not one where you can actually intervene. So, of course, all sorts of beneficial aspects for the environment. You know, we live on a floodplain. Trees love water. They'll suck up all the water. They'll make the land better for cows. You've got to make sure you keep the deer out. They're rather invasive, I'm afraid. And the nice thing about it, and particularly in the next 10 or 15 years when I move to Scotland permanently, as I live now in Switzerland, I'll be able to watch the trees grow from my kitchen while the clouds roll in to water the factory. So we're going to change the environment from horrible monoculture trees to beautiful woodlands and chairs. And in fact, we'll have all the major indigenous species that are approved by the Forestry Commission, which, you know, you'll see some of those there: birch, hazel, willow, rowan, ash, alder, aspen, juniper, wild cherry, elder, wych elm, and hawthorn. And we've got buildings there that we can sort of put things in and grow it as a bit of a cultural center for people to come, maybe to learn about tree shaping and design, maybe a facility for tree or art projects, and perhaps even a green woodcraft centre, which is an old medieval technique which has died out and is now being revived in England, where you use simple green wood to grow into objects which you can then use practically, which are much stronger than ones made with nails and aluminium and other man-made materials. And then finally, perhaps just a tree and nature centre for city kids to come out and enjoy, and perhaps a nice day for all the family. So if you have been listening, thank you.